Let's talk about the endgames in Fire Emblem Engage and if they are any good or what are some issues with them. So first let's define what an endgame usually is. Now it's going to be different in Fire Emblem, but this is the definition. The final stage of a game, such as chess or bridge, where few pieces or cards remain. In chess, as the match progresses, material is lost/removed, especially in relation to time. So as the match progresses, you lose material, you don't get it back. Here's an example of an endgame where most of the pieces are off the board and the game has largely been simplified. So the key here is simplification. So the general process of playing chess is you have your opening, which is moves to establish a middle game. You have your middle game, which is where you make big plays, and then you have your end game where you can still make big plays, but it's harder and more, drawn out. It can end in an actual draw often. In the case of Fire Emblem, however, we want to look at the end game. This is the end game in Fire Emblem Engage. So this is chapter 25. So in FE Engage, as the game progresses, maps feature more enemies, more reinforcements, and more deployed units. So you have more things, they have more things. The game spams a ton of enemy reinforcements. This is what beating chapter 25 normally looks like, where there's just like a ton of enemies, you have to deal with them all. After overcoming the very long waves of seemingly infinite enemies, eventually the player can make progress. So making progress is the key here. Now, instead of doing this way, you can always just use the warp staff and skip everything, which is very standard for chapter 25. You just get your units in a plus shape, you bring in Micaiah, you just warp them in there, and then go kill the boss. So why would you want to deal with this when you could just beat this in 5 minutes instead? Most people just opt to warp skip a lot of these endgame maps. So let's talk about good endgames. So the primary issue in Fire Emblem is the final chapters do not feel like an endgame and instead add more enemies and units, making turns and generally maps take longer. So when you have more units, you have to calculate more. When there's more enemies, you have to calculate more. When there's infinite reinforcements, you have to calculate more. So instead of the game simplifying or being like a streamlined challenge, it more expands and gets out of control, and that's why they just start throwing waves of enemies at you. If you warp skip, however, they are always fast. So the funny thing is the end game basically lets you skip it. So you either take 2 to 3 hours to beat a map, or you beat it in like 10 minutes. There's no like in between. There's no like happy medium, which is where I think they should be, or they should aim to be. There lacks a meaningful middle ground, where these maps take reasonable amounts of time to complete and also present a challenge to the player. Another chess endgame example, fewer pieces on the board, but tactics and planning are still relevant. So this is a 2-rook endgame with 3 pawns on both sides. I'm not sure if white or black has an advantage here. This is just a random image I grabbed off of Google. But this still would require calculation, like, maybe the king moves here, gets checked, moves in further. This check's not available. Like if he checked from here, he could check from here, and then you could like drop back, and then you'd have to like maybe challenge this somehow. White seems to be better here, but this is an example of you could have a simple position, or what seems to be a simple position with a lot of variations, a lot of like calculation to be done. And in the case of Engage, the end game, and in a lot of Fire Emblems, the end game is like you have 20 units, they have 50 units, they have reinforcements, you have all these broken builds, they have all these crazy things. It's just kind of like a chaotic situation. Alright, so why reinforcements? Reinforcement spam is likely done in Engage endgames to keep the player under pressure. It may have been a fast solution to balancing out the absurd power of emblems when used correctly, to prevent the player from just breaking down every enemy position, or breaking down enemy positions and winning easily, as enemies do not have engage abilities. However, endless reinforcements are not fun to play against, and an overwhelming majority of the player base simply warp skips endgame maps instead of spending 2 hours fighting the exact same enemies in sequence, because that's usually what you're fighting, because it is busy work more so than a tactical challenge that requires a smart or clever solution. So this is like the problem, right? It's not like they have an interesting position you have to break down and they have all these like nuanced things going on. It's more just like, here's 2 axes and a sniper. Two warriors and a sniper that attack you. All right, here's another wave of those. Here's another wave of those. It doesn't even really present a challenge. It just kind of slows you down, and that's kind of the issue. Like once your builds are good, you know what you're doing. It just really feels like the maps just slow you down, more so than challenge you. Engage could limit the amount of units and emblems per fight, so this is like an idea, or at the very least to make reinforcements tied to something that you can manually stop. So there have been situations in like 3 houses where there's like on the bridge map, chapter 15 I think, there's 2 fortresses, or there's a fortress. You can kill like these 4 guards. It stops infinite reinforcements of 1 enemy unit appearing. And then if you kill a boss, it stops the other infinite reinforcements of 1 enemy appearing. So there's a wave of 2 enemies that slow you down as you push this bridge, but there's a way to stop it and it's explained. That's totally fine because it's not every map and there's a way to stop it and it's kind of controllable and it's not like 5 enemies, it's 1 enemy. So it's not the worst thing. So it's like something you can play around. The current endgame trend of everything appearing from everywhere is a small nightmare and turns the endgame into a tower defense minigame that you must play unless you warp skip. Then when the map decides you've killed enough mindless suicidal red units, you may proceed. So essentially you like have the starting position and then red units just keep funneling into you. And you just keep killing them, you keep killing them, you keep killing them. And then aside from chapter 26, which doesn't stop, the map then decides, okay, you may proceed now. So it's not even like there's some compelling strategic position to overcome. It's just like spam, 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 spam. Oh, you dealt with the spam? Okay, you can go on. And it feels like it just exists to slow down the player more so than present a challenge or force you to think on your feet or to adapt to what the enemy's doing. Let's talk about the final boss. So the final boss has emblems that maintain a damage reducing shield. You kill the 4 emblems, the shield lowers, you deal some damage, and the map spawns in more emblems / resets the shield. This is a typical boss fight, right? No. So alright, so here's what the boss fight should have been. Okay, and this is usually how boss fights go. A boss fight is usually just a series of patterns and sequences. So if you show me this thing where it's like, oh, he has 4 health bars, there's 4 emblems, you kill the 4 emblems, his shield lowers, you take off a health bar, his shield goes back up, it spawns in 4 more emblems. You've established a pattern, and you're basically like taking in like assumed player knowledge of having played other games and fought other bosses into this. Like we're factoring this in when designing these boss fights, and essentially you can't just assume that the player's not going to look for some pattern, right? Like most bosses are just like patterns. So when you have this boss where you take the shield down and you can just kill it, you've essentially broken out. Now it's fine to not just follow like patterns used in other games, but you've essentially like broken out of what's typical in a game where there's like health bars and bosses. And here's what happens. So if you just take off a health bar and then wait a turn, it gets its shield back, and then you can take the things down again, but it just starts spawning infinite reinforcements. This is the problem with this map. So you can kill the emblems quickly, but then the map just starts randomly, for no reason, spawning in infinite reinforcements from different positions. Now, if the boss summoned enemies as an ability, and that was one of his turns, if he had like 2 turns, he like attacks 1 turn and then summons another turn, that would be logical. That would feel like a boss fight. This boss fight is one of the worst maps I've ever played in my life because there's 2 ways to beat it. There's the painful way, and then there's the right way. The painful way is you keep taking down the emblems, you take down as many health bars as you can, and then you keep taking down the emblems, but without like the plan or the tactic of just killing him in a single turn. What you should do, the good way, is you kill 3 out of the 4 emblems, you set up a kill with dancer combos, and then you kill the 4th emblem on the next turn, and then just kill him in 1 turn. That's what you should do. And if you don't, it'll spawn in 6 times. So this fight will start spawning in 6 times flying enemies. So 6 flying enemies that double you in 1 round all of your weak units, and 2 random enemies at random positions every turn until you die, forcing a kind of pseudo LTC metagame for the final chapter, where you intentionally kill the 4th emblem to lower the shield and set up a kill on Sombron to not deal with the nightmare that is chapter 26 infinite reinforcements. So on my first blind run on chapter 26, I legitimately was like, oh, okay, so there's some reinforcements, maybe just kill them, there's like 2 or 3 waves. I was on like the 10th or 11th wave of the map spawning in 8 enemies a turn before I realized that I was supposed to kill the boss faster. and I was like over calculating things. I was on that map for like 3 hours in that first attempt. I was like, why are there so many enemies? Like, where are they coming from? Like, why is this? It's not explained to the player. They just keep appearing. There's no way to stop it. Like, the entire map just forces you just to kill the boss fast. But then it's like, okay, well, why why even have a shield then? Just like, it's not like, the funny thing is, it's like once you understand the map, it's so easy. But before you understand the map, it can be like a small nightmare just to deal with. Same thing with Chapter 25. Chapter 25, if you don't warp skip it, takes like 2 to 3 hours because it just keeps spawning in enemies and just slows you down. And the only good endgame chapter, I would say, is Chapter 24. So let's go to the conclusion now. All right, FE Engage. All right, so just to recap, I do think the game has great mechanics and some fun builds and team comps. Its endgame suffers due to a mixture of power creep on the player's part and enemy spam on the map's part. So one of the main issues is power creep from the player. So they probably felt that as players hit the endgame from testing, like, oh, okay, they have these crazy builds, they have all these abilities, we need something to deal with these. So instead of just balancing or nerfing some abilities, which would be fine, like maybe Bonded Shield can only work like 2 or 3 times, then it stops working. So you can't just tank like 50 things in a row. Like, you need limitations and caps. Instead of balancing, they figure, okay, we'll just spam enemies. The warp skip endgame meta exists because most players do not want to fight the same enemies on a conveyor belt. I think this is the fundamental issue. It'd be different if it was like a 3-part battle where you fight like, you know, so many enemies and then they get like a new army with different things and a different formation. That would be different. And these aren't just void cursed enemies that just never stop. They want a tactical challenge, unique experience to overcome. Chapter 24 does present one, so I'll call it this is the best, as the best endgame map. I do think Chapter 24 is a good map because it has a turn limit, so they know they planned around you beating it quickly, and the map is relatively, it's like moderately difficult unless your team is bad, or if your team is bad. But if your team is good, it's pretty easy. But it's a clean map that's fast. There's reinforcements, but not a ton. And there's a unique map mechanic that's fun to play around that you actually have to consider. The rest are just tower defense maps that let you push or warp skip and ignore it all anyways. So that's my main issue with reinforcements, is that very often it doesn't present a challenge, it just slows you down. And there's a difference, right? Because a challenge forces you to improve, adapt, and come up with something new or to do something interesting. And I think for a lot of these newer Fire Emblem games like Three Houses and Engage, it's more about the unit building than it is about the player skill, because you can just build broken units and cracked abilities, or using cracked abilities, and get little monsters that just beat the game for you. Like, you can have tanks that just, like Ike tanks that just tank 10, 15 things in a row and kill them all, and you just put them in a position and just don't even worry about them. So I think all of these things mixing together is why we ended up with this endgame. So I don't necessarily blame them for doing this, but I do think with just rebalancing abilities, they could have achieved more enjoyable endgames that are still challenging, that aren't just like conveyor belt design, you know, factory enemy design. Because a lot of the maps, it's like, oh, you have to go do this and do this and do this. You have to get all these, on Chapter 22, get all these emblems, but then the map like keeps spawning in things that attack you. And then same thing with like Chapter 23, like you have to go attack, but then the map dives you. They freeze you and attack you. There's all these like freeze bot enemies with, you know, staves and stuff. So ultimately, I think the endgame could have been done better. I think Chapter 24 is the only endgame map I actually enjoy. 25 is a warp skip or it's a slog. 26 is a fast, like you play efficiently, or it's a slog. Because like once those 8 times enemies start spawning in, unless you have 8 units that can all one-round something every turn, which is probably not very likely unless you're running DLC, that's a nightmare. Because like the thing that can happen is, let's say you kill 6 out of 8 and 2 are left, 8 more spawn in, now there's 10 enemies. Let's say you kill 6 more, now there's 4. 8 more spawn. Like, they literally just kill you by, it's like death by like suffocation. It's completely against tactical gameplay. It's completely counterintuitive. Their army is just infinite for no reason, because why not? It doesn't feel like a good boss fight. But that's it for this one. I just wanted to talk about end games, enemy spam, reinforcements, all this stuff. Definitely like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.